Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with us in studio, we have James Shikwati, David Owiro, Sarah Maka, and also our audience of experts and students from the University of Nairobi. Now, I'll just start with Sarah, who's joining us from Nigeria. Maybe if you could just tell us, what kind of reforms does Africa want? What are some of the progresses that we should be looking out for?
I think there are three main kinds of reforms that we're looking for. Number one is the cost of capital. I mentioned this earlier. You know, we have an opportunity this year as South Africa is leading the G20, which is a very important development. It's the first time an African country is leading the group of 20, which is the group of 20 largest economies in the world. And South African presidency has already started working on the debt issues on the continent and the high cost of capital. So Africa is looking for a lot more concessional financing, so lower the cost of borrowing money so that we don't have to pay such large debt receipts into generations to come. The second is that we need to work on trade within the continent. So again, there are things that the architecture, the global financial architecture needs to fix. But there are also things that we as Africans need to have the agency to drive. And we have to look at how do we make the continental free trade area more active and implementable. There are few protocols moving people across the continent. Many countries need to put that into activity. They need to ratify those protocols. So there's some things that Africa can do, but back on the context of the global financial architecture, there's also the methodology of defining risk actually penalizes African countries. So what we call the Basel III reform. So Basel III is what banking system and banks use to identify what you need to do to mitigate risk. So this came up in 2008 when the Lehman Brothers and the 2008 financial crashes, Lehman Brothers company went down. So they put these stringent rules so that we don't see that again. But unfortunately, those stringent rules make it so that Africa has a higher hurdle to climb to demonstrate safety. One of the rules is that if you're taking money from a risky investment or risky country, you need to put more liquidity in the bank to back up that investment. And because many African countries are deemed as risky, people will rather invest in less risky environments than in Africa, which harms us at the end of the day. So we need to relook at the Basel III framework and really change the math, the equation that defines risk. So these are some of the reforms that Africa is asking for. But I really believe that this year, being a G20 year with an African country in the lead, we have an opportunity to change some of that, those structural biases that impact Africa negatively.
So, David, I want to come to you on that question of global representation that Sarah's mentioning. And Africa now does have two seats at the G20, also has seats at the IMF board. Isn't this enough? Is this enough for global representation for the continent? Why hasn't anything changed?
What you have to think about is it representative of the voice of Africa? Does Africa have governing power, for instance? Does it have influence and agency to push through its ideas and its vision for the world? And you know, on the impact side, you would almost ask, are we seeing from the policies that are coming out of those global institutions, does Africa have an imprint in those policies? And the answer would be maybe not so much. And that's why you see, I would say, a push by the African Union to have alternatives. So for instance, what comes to mind here is with the credit agencies, rating agencies you have, recently the launch of an Africa-wide one that's African Union driven, to the extent that it will actually influence lenders and creditors is another question to maybe not so much, or maybe it's too early to tell. But I would say it's not yet enough. If you remember, the African Union has always, the FDB especially, has always been a member of the board of the G20, but has it translated to actually having an imprint? One would argue not so much.
Right, so James, beyond the representation issue and the agitation for reform, are there structural issues within the global financial markets, for instance, that disadvantage Africa aside from the institutions and their policies?
Yeah, the first structural point is perception. How do they look at Africa? And I think, as it has been ably mentioned, that risk factor keeps, ringing the negative bell that then makes it difficult for investments and monies to come to Africa. So I think what I foresee here is for Africa to take advantage of competing institutions. I can imagine if Kenya was relying on World Bank, maybe there'll be no standard gauge railway, So meaning that Kenya picked an alternative. And therefore, I think what Africa needs to be looking at is, first of all, who are the emerging competitors? How good or how fair are they? And how can we set the rules of the game so that then when they're competing within the African space, it ends up benefiting Africa? We know that Africa is in huge demand for infrastructure development. There's no way we are going to succeed with our continental free trade area when there are no railway lines, no highways, no bridges, no ports. The financing architecture as it is now might never really deliver those ports and highways to Africa. So Africa needs to open up in terms of who else can play in its space. And we've seen Asian countries, of course, led by China, positioning themselves strategically to be drivers of infrastructure development. The second lowest hanging fruit would be the digital technology, because we've seen already countries experimenting on the possibility of how they can create a financing system that relies on digitalization. So, and knowing that Africa is a youthful continent, internet penetration is moving at a very high pace. I think that would be also another aspect that Africa needs to explore on how to use the digital superhighway to sort out its financing aspects. And lastly, of course, build markets. Because if we don't build our own market here in Africa, the external markets are not going to really look in our favor.
Right.
So I think we need to go beyond just proclamations, agreements, to actually building markets.
Let's just get the sentiments of Sarah on the same. Sarah, maybe if you could just talk about the global financial governance. We've seen that the structures are not necessarily in our favor, and the voting rights in the IMF are very, very skewed. Even the World Bank, when we talk about Africa accounting for about 17% of the world's population, holding less than 7% of the IMF voting rights, how exactly are these institutions supposed to change this? How are we getting the African voices?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. So there are 10 shareholders of the World Bank that actually hold 54.5% of all the voting power. So let me give you an example. It means a Belgian citizen, because effectively a country holds shareholding power. So a Belgian citizen has 37 times more power than a Chinese and 180 times more power than an Ethiopian. So when the Committee of Nations sits to decide, those countries have much louder voices. So one of the things on the IMF side that Africa has been pushing for is to have more voting power. And yes, we have increased the voting power of African bloc, but I don't think it's not enough. It's not enough for what we need. There is a conversation around why the World Bank exists. Does it exist for the shareholders, or does it exist to eradicate poverty and serve low and middle income countries? If that's the mission, to serve low and middle income countries, then those are the clients. So they must get feedback from their clients. They must get voice from their clients for them to be legitimate. So I think there's advocacy around the legitimacy of the World Bank and IMF, given how skewed the voting powers are. But we have to know that power is never given, it is taken. So what is Africa doing to take this power? I think it lies on our ability to increase our contribution and value to the global trade. James mentioned it earlier. we contribute 3% to the global economy. And we have assets. Africa is one of the richest continents in the world. We have assets, but our 54 countries have poorly shared and sold those assets without adding value. I think in 2025, with the tariff wars coming our way, we need to collectively, again, I use the word collectively, bargain for Africa. So until we collectively have bargaining power, that power won't translate to institutions of the world that disproportionately impact what happens to us. So it behooves Africa to have one voice when it comes to negotiating for adding value to our critical green minerals that the rest of the world needs and we have in abundance. If we don't negotiate together as one continent, then we set ourselves up for failure. So I think that's one of the critical things we need to do going forward.
Right, so we're going to take some questions from the audience. Let's start off here.
My name is Georgina Mwikali from the University of Nairobi. So my first question goes to James. So why do African countries still rely on the foreign currencies such as the USD and euros, yet they are trading among themselves?
It's a tough question, but it has a historical reason to it. Initially, the financial architecture in the older days, in the 18th century, they would back currency with gold, what they used to call the gold standard. And then that, of course, disappeared during the First World War. And then it's in 1944 that when the major powers that won when they met at the Bretton Woods nominated the dollar. They picked on the dollar because at that time the US was the factory of the world, producing all the goods that many of the countries were using during the war. And that dollar was picked on the condition that it has to be backed up by gold. And then, of course, challenges to the dollar came in the 70s, where the US abandoned the backing of its currency with the gold to what nowadays we call the petrodollar. So for Africa to effectively have its currency become a global reserve currency, there's a lot of work to be done, part of what we are discussing today in terms of productivity. We have the potential. We've been talking about it for over 60 years, and now the reality is hitting us that nobody really cares about us unless we care about ourselves to make sure we activate this potential, then have a bargaining power to be able to get our currencies to be part of the international reserve currencies. And that's why I said we have a tool in diplomacy, thanks to BRICS and the South-South movement. Now we have a tool because Africa is really home to strategic minerals that the rest of the industrialized countries need. So if we harness our voice and speak as one, that will give us a possibility to gain a chance in having our currencies in the international reserve system.
Let's take another question from our audience.
My name is Christian Mutunga. My question goes to David or Sarah. So while Africa is exploring options from ranging from withdrawing from these giant institutions, what are the possible implications that could arise from moves like withdrawing or forming alliances with other institutions that are regional or still international?
Let's start with you, Sarah.
So the implications of withdrawing from a global financial architecture are not insignificant, and it's one that we need to think about critically. I think the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is a step to mitigate the impacts of the global financial architecture on Africa. So what the Continental Free Trade Area is saying is we want to trade with each other. But remember, to trade with each other, we have to have something to trade. And if we have 600 million people without electricity, how do we power this trade? So there's some work that we have to do internally to be ready for that kind of withdrawal. The second thing I'll add is, to Georgina's question, we have within the Continental Free Trade Area something called the PAPS, which is the inter-settlement of currency. So I can buy something as a Ghanaian from Ghana with my Ghanaian cedis. It will clear through a central clearance mechanism and I can pay you in Kenya for that thing I bought in Kenyan shillings. I don't need dollars, because right now what you do is you carry dollars across the border, transfer it to shillings, and then pay. But what the Afreximbank is building, along with the Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, is that central clearing system. And currently 15 African countries are using it. Ideally, 54 African countries start using it. So again, to withdraw, I think we need to strengthen our position, because if we don't strengthen our position, it will be like a weak member of the pack staying back, and we're susceptible to being eaten effectively by a predator. So we need to be strong for us to not just, I don't know if it's withdrawing that's required, but dictate the terms of engagement for Africa. Until we get to that place, there are not very many alternatives for us.
All right, so we're going to take final comments from our panelists here. Let me start off with you, David. As you wind up, if the current system cannot be reformed from within, is it time for Africa to look for alternatives? Very briefly with your winding up statements.
Yeah, I'd say connecting it to being tactful more than anything. We'd have to think about what is it in the current financial system pains us the most. In my mind, debt architecture is one of those. And so thinking through the kind of reforms that we require there and being strategic in going for those reforms would be more strategic for Africa.
Right, James, very briefly, your winding up comment.
Yeah, I would go for, of course, reforms of the existing, while being aware that it won't take us far, but plan B being opening up for other competing alternatives that Africa can use, because competition will then put pressure for the reform to take off. Otherwise, without competition, reform will just keep being, statements for politicians.
Right, Sarah?
I'll say two things. The first is Africa must prove domestically that we can strengthen our collective economy. And the only way we do that is by one voice, speaking in one voice and acting as a collective. Secondly, we will not stop advocating and speaking for the changes in the global financial architecture. We'll use every mechanism, including the G20. We'll use our advocates, our civil society, our young people, because it's very important that the young people understand the implications of Africa being penalized by global financial architecture and use their voice. They're so creative. Use their creative voice and their digital ability to push for change globally, while putting our feet to the fire locally, that we must change for ourselves, because there's no one out there to save us. Africa must drive change internally.
And that's all we have time for on this special edition of Talk Africa, co-produced with TV47. A big thank you to our guests, James Shikwati, founder of the Interregion Economic Network, David Owiro, an advisor of Africa Development Think Tank, and Sarah Maka, Africa Executive Director for the One Campaign. Also, thank you to our audience of experts and students from the University of Nairobi.
Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa.
I'm Hibak Said from TV47.
And I'm Beatrice Marshall from CGTN. From all of us here, thank you for watching and see you next time.